bless you, Korean cookie mask. Mm. All right. Okay, I see the eyes. Okay. Ooh, that's cold. I do not like this. Okay. Mm. Let's do the nose. Ah, okay. Okay, so this says, hey Siri, set timer for 20 minutes.
20 minutes, starting now.
Thank you. All right, so let's do a story while we do this, okay? Okay. Okay. This is a story about a praying mother, Praying, set in Houston, Texas, okay? And it says, the humidity in Third Ward didn't just sit on the skin, it sank into the marrow. For Evelyn Vance, a woman whose life was measured in Sunday hats and scuffed floorboards. Oh, I'm sorry, y'all. Let me start again. Okay. All right. I don't know if y'all heard me or not, so I'm going to start all over. Okay. All right. So, the humidity in Third Ward didn't just sit on the skin, it sank into the marrow. For Evelyn Vance, a woman whose life was measured in Sunday hats and scuffed floorboards, that heaviness felt like the weight of a dozen unanswered prayers. Okay? Evelyn was known at the Greater Canaan Missionary Baptist Church as a prayer warrior. But by the summer of 2026, the fire in her spirit had soured into something caustic, toxic, and hateful. The breaking point. It wasn't one big sin that did it, it was the slow rot of entitlement. Her husband, Otis, had traded his dignity for a bottle of cheap bourbon, spending his pension before the check even cleared. Her son, Terrence, was 34, living in her back room, selling things that didn't belong to him to fund a lifestyle he had not earned and did not deserve. Her daughter, Keisha, only called when she needed bail money or a place to hide from the consequences of her own cruelty. One Tuesday, after finding her heirloom wedding ring missing from her jewelry box, likely pawned by Terrence, Evelyn didn't cry. I say it, Evelyn did not cry. She sat at her kitchen table, the Houston heat shimmering off the pavement outside, and opened her Bible to the imprecatory Psalms. Lord, she whispered, her voice like dry parchment, I have tended this garden for 40 years, and all I've grown is weeds. If they won't be changed, let them be removed. Clear my path. The thinning of the line. The first was Otis. A week after she had said this prayer, he collapsed in the middle of a heat wave while walking home from the liquor store. The coroner called it heat stroke, exacerbated by a weak heart. Evelyn stood over his open casket at the funeral home with a face of stone. She felt a lightness in her chest she hadn't felt since the 90s. Then came Terrence. 2 months later, a misunderstanding over a debt behind a gas station on Scott Street ended in a flurry of blue lights and yellow tape. When the detectives knocked on Evelyn's door, she nodded as if they were delivering the mail. Finally, there was Keisha. She died in a high-speed chase on I-45 North. The car spinning out of control and over the guardrail. "The Lord gives," Evelyn murmured to the empty living room, "and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." The silence in the house. By Christmas, the house on Wheeler Avenue was spotless. No boots tracked mud onto the carpet. No shouting echoed through the vents. The silence was absolute, shimmering like the heat off the bayou. Evelyn sat in her recliner, clutching her leather-bound Bible. She had prayed for peace, and she had received it. But as she looked at the photos on the mantel, the faces of the people she had once loved, now erased by her own tongue, she realized a terrifying truth. She had spent her life asking God to move mountains, only to find that once the mountains were gone, the landscape was a flat, barren wasteland. She was a woman with a direct line to the divine, and she had used it to turn herself into an island. In the stillness of the Houston night, Evelyn bowed her head to pray one last time, but for the first time in 70 years, she found she had absolutely nothing to ask for. The moral of the story is be careful what you ask for, because you sure enough might get it. Be careful what you ask for, because you sure might get it. Make sure that's what you want. Okay. The neighbors. The neighbors on Wheeler Avenue didn't miss much. In a neighborhood where people spent their evenings on porches, fighting the Gulf Coast humidity with oscillating fans and sweet tea, the Vance house had become a grim spectator sport. Miss Pearl, who lived in the Teal bungalow next door, had lived in the Third Ward long enough to know the difference between a tragedy and a reckoning. Mm-mm. Yes, honey, the observation deck. From her wicker chair, Miss Pearl watched the Vance family cycle through their final acts. She had seen it all. The constant low rumble of Otis's drunken singing had been replaced by a silence so sharp it felt like a ringing in the ears. She noticed Evelyn's garden. Usually the woman struggled with the weeds, but lately the flower beds were manicured with a violent precision. Evelyn didn't just pull weeds, She yanked them as if she were tearing out the throat of the earth. Pearl remembered the day after Terrence passed. She'd brought over a plate of smothered pork chops, a neighborly gesture for the grieving. Evelyn had opened the door, dressed in crisp iron white. She didn't look like a mother who had lost a son. She looked like a general who had just won a war. Okay. The view from the fence. Miss Pearl began to keep a mental tally. It wasn't just that they were dying, it was the timing. It was too neat. In Houston, life is messy. Deaths are usually lingering, complicated affairs, but the Vances were dropping like ripe fruit from a tree in a storm. Yes, honey, there's a certain kind of prayer that don't sound like please, Miss Pearl whispered to her cat one evening, watching Miss Evelyn sweep her porch for the fourth time that day. There's a kind of a prayer that sounds like enough. Miss Pearl noticed that Miss Evelyn had stopped going to the midweek Bible study. When Miss Pearl asked her why, Miss Evelyn had simply adjusted her glasses and said, "I don't need to go to the house of the Lord to be heard, Miss Pearl. He's right here in the kitchen with me." The hair on Miss Pearl's arm stood up. It wasn't the words, it was the satisfaction in Miss Evelyn's eyes. It was the look of a woman who had finally gotten her house in order. The final inspection. After Keisha's funeral, the neighborhood became quiet in a way that felt unnatural. The birds seemed to avoid the trees overhanging Miss Evelyn's roof. Miss Pearl watched through her screen door as Miss Evelyn came out to the sidewalk one evening. The older woman stood under the amber glow of the street lamps, looking up at the stars through the Houston haze. She looked younger. The stoop in her back was gone. The heavy sigh she carried for 30 years had evaporated. But Miss Pearl also saw what Miss Evelyn couldn't, the cost. Miss Evelyn was pure now, sure. She was unburdened, of course. But she was also a ghost in a house of ghosts. Miss Pearl realized that when Miss Pearl realized then that Miss Evelyn hadn't just prayed her family away, she had prayed the world away. The unspoken truth. The porch light. Miss Evelyn left it off now. She wasn't waiting for anyone to come home, because Terrence and Keisha and Otis never would again. Okay? The Sunday best. Miss Evelyn wore black even on Tuesdays like a permanent uniform of victory. The eye contact. When they met at the fence, Miss Evelyn's eyes were like mirrors, cold and reflective. Child, that's what 40 years of suffering will do to you, baby. Yes, that is what it will do. Miss Pearl stopped bringing over plates. She stopped calling out greetings across the driveway. You don't interrupt a woman who is on a first name basis with the angel of death. Okay. Especially when she is finally happy with the results. Yes, honey. Yes, honey. I'm trying to tell you. The humidity had broken just enough for a stray breeze to rattle the dry husk of the crepe myrtles. Miss Pearl was out back, deadheading the zinnias, when she saw Miss Evelyn standing by the chain link fence that separated their properties. Miss Evelyn was dressed in a pale linen suit, looking as cool as a glass of ice water despite the Houston sun. She was clutching a pair of heavy duty gardening shears. The encounter. "You've been awfully quiet lately, Miss Evelyn," Pearl said, her voice cautious, intentionally keeping the fence between them. "I haven't seen a car in your driveway for 3 weeks, not even a visitor." Miss Evelyn didn't look up from the fence line. She was staring at a patch of stubborn, invasive vines crawling over from Pearl's side. "Well, the Lord promised me a quiet habitation." Pearl, Isaiah 32, a resting place that is sure. I'm just enjoying the fulfillment of God's holy word. "Is that what you call it?" Miss Pearl felt a cold prickle at the base of her neck. "Fulfillment? It looks more like a clearance sale to me. You've lost your whole house, woman. Don't you feel the draft?" Miss Evelyn finally looked up. Her eyes weren't red from crying. They were clear, bright, and terrifyingly calm. "You see a draft, Pearl, because you like the clutter," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a low rhythmic hum. "You like the noise of people who don't love you. I decided I'd rather be alone in a cathedral than crowded in a den of thieves. I asked for the thorns to be pulled, and God pulled them. I don't mourn the weeds." The chilling truth. Miss Pearl gripped her trowel until her knuckles turned ash gray. "Those weren't weeds, Evie. That was your blood and kin. Otis was a fool, and those kids were a handful, but they were yours. You can't just pray people into the ground because they're inconvenient." Miss Evelyn stepped closer to the fence, the shears clicking shut with a sharp metallic snap. "Inconvenient?" Miss Evelyn smiled for the first time in 30 years. Pearl saw the woman's teeth. It wasn't a kind look. They were a debt I didn't owe anymore. I spent 40 years asking for their change. One morning, I realized I was asking the wrong question. I stopped asking for them to be better. I started asking for them to be gone. She leaned in, her voice a jagged whisper that carried over the fence. "And you know what the best part is, Pearl? The silence don't talk back. The silence doesn't steal my jewelry. The silence doesn't smell like gin. The silence doesn't disrespect each other in my house. The silence doesn't disrespect me. The silence doesn't hate everything that I do for them. The silence isn't ungrateful. It's just me and the Holy Spirit now." The final severance. Miss Pearl backed away, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked at the Vance house. The windows were dark, the curtains pulled tight, looking less like a home and more like a cemetery. "You're dangerous, Evelyn Vance," Miss Pearl whispered. "Now," Evelyn replied, turning back to the vines and raising her shears, "I'm just answered." As Miss Pearl retreated into her own kitchen, she heard the rhythmic snip, snip, snip of Evelyn working the fence line. It sounded like a clock ticking down to zero. Miss Pearl reached for her phone, but she didn't know who to call. There was no law against a prayer being answered, no matter how cold the answer was. ah, mm, 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 mm. All right, you guys. The epilogue. By the summer of 2027, the 2400 block of Wheeler Avenue had changed. Houston's relentless cycle of gentrification and decay usually moved in predictable waves, but around the Vance property, the rhythm had stuttered. All right, that's my timer. Okay. The house at 2412 was no longer just a building, it was a landmark of the unsaid. Okay, it was a landmark of the unsaid. The neighborhood shiver. The neighborhood kids who used to shortcut through the alley behind Miss Evelyn's house to get to the corner store now took the long way around on Claiborne Street. They didn't have a name for it, no stories of ghosts or rattling chains, just a collective instinctual urge to avoid the property. The atmosphere. Even in the 100-degree August heat, the air around Miss Evelyn's fence felt thin and brittle, like old paper. The wildlife. The stray cats that used to fight over scraps in the Vance driveway had migrated 2 blocks over. Even the grackles, usually bold and screeching, avoided the oak tree in her front yard. The aesthetic. The house was a masterpiece of suburban isolation. The lawn was a flat neo-green carpet. The windows were perpetually shuttered. It looked less like a home and more like a cemetery or a mausoleum made of brick and mortar. Miss Pearl's vigil. Miss Pearl still sat on her porch, but she installed a new trellis with thick climbing roses to block her view of Evelyn's driveway. She couldn't shake the feeling that Evelyn's answered prayers were contagious, that if you looked too long, she might start identifying the weeds in your life. If you look too long at Miss Evelyn's house, and Miss Evelyn gonna get rid of them weeds, I guarantee. Okay. One evening, Miss Pearl saw a for sale sign go up 3 houses down. The neighbors were leaving, not because of crime or rising taxes, but because of the silence. It's a heavy kind of quiet, Miss Pearl whispered to the mailman, the kind that makes you wonder if you're next on the list for removal. The woman in the window. On the anniversary of Keisha's death, Miss Pearl saw Evelyn for the first time in months. The front door opened and Evelyn stepped out to retrieve a package. She looked magnificent. Her hair was a halo of snowy white, her skin smooth and unlined. The stress that had etched deep canyons into her face for 40 years had been ironed out by the absence of grief. She looked like a woman who had never known a day of labor or a night of worry. Miss Evelyn caught Pearl staring through the roses. She didn't wave, she didn't scowl. She simply offered a small, serene nod. The look of a woman who has successfully bargained with the Almighty and won. As Miss Evelyn stepped back inside and the heavy deadbolt clicked into place, the neighborhood settled back into its uneasy peace. Miss Evelyn Vance was the most blessed woman in the Third Ward. She had everything she had asked for: a clean house, a quiet life, and a direct line to God Almighty, who listened with terrifying precision to every word she uttered. She sat in her kitchen, poured a single cup of tea, and listened to the hum of the air conditioner. There was no one to disappoint her, no one to fail her, no one to lie on her, mistreat her, or disrespect her, even to dishonor her. To Miss Evelyn, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. This concludes the story of Miss Evelyn Vance and the weight of her answered prayer. I hope you like it. Let me know down in the comments below. I got more coming. All right. I will talk to y'all later. This story is called The Answered Prayer of Miss Evelyn Vance.